Again, I'm David Morris. I'm the publisher of Lake Drive Books. We are an independent book publisher, publishing spiritual books that help you heal, grow, and discover. And I am your host and facilitator tonight. I'm also in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Uh, this is called We Can Write About Hard Things. We hope that this is a rich conversation with our four women authors about how we talk about how to express ourselves about things that maybe the world keeps hidden, handling the emotional toll it might take, and the impact on others who hear our stories and insights. Whether you're a writer, an author, or just wanting to learn how to express yourself better, boy, that's a skill we all need to find our way into. I'd like to offer a short bio of each of our panelists. I'll start off with Caroline Beidler. MSW is an addiction recovery advocate who has 20 years in leadership within social work and ministry. She's also the author of two books, and most recently, You Are Not Your Trauma, Uproot Unhealthy Patterns, Heal the Family Tree. The book is about 5 rhythms for moving beyond intergenerational trauma. She lives in Eastern Tennessee. From Caroline Beidler to Dr. Zoe Shaw, no particular order here. Dr. Shaw, Dr. Zoe is a licensed psychotherapist with a doctorate in clinical psychology who for 20 years has helped women overcome complex shame and codependency. You're going to keep us rooted, right, Dr. Shaw?
Yes.
Thank you. She's the author of best-selling Year of Self-Care, Daily Practices and Inspiration for Caring for Yourself, which includes 365 short but thought-provoking exercises to help us be our most authentic selves. Dr. Shaw is in the LA area. Kristen LaValle is a writer and storyteller whose words offer refreshing perspective on faith and spirituality. She offers insights that intersect doubt and belief, hope and suffering, beauty and heartache. She's the author of the recently released Even If He Doesn't, What We Believe About God When Life Doesn't Make Sense, which shares her story and unpacks the nuances of suffering and faith. Kristen is in Massachusetts. And Shannon Evans. We've got two more here. Just a couple more minutes. Shannon Evans. Well, I apologize. I left you off of the reminder, Shannon, that came out recently. So I just wanted to make sure you weren't left out. She is the spirituality and culture editor for at the National Catholic Reporter and author of several books, including most recently, The Mystics Would Like a Word, 6 Women Who Met God and Found a Spirituality for Today, which is just out last week, which is about a search for Christian spirituality that embraces the entire reality of womanhood. I don't need to tell you what that is. You all know. And Shannon lives in central Iowa. And finally, Lori Ferguson Wilbert, a writer who has written for Christianity Today, Fathom Magazine, and She Reads Truth. She's the author of The Understory, An Invitation to Rootedness and Resilience from the Forest Floor, which is about her story of alienation and disorientation after years of unrest in the evangelical church, and how she found the forest to be a place to learn how to live when everything seems to be falling apart. And she lives in New York State, near the Adirondacks, I believe. And just a reminder, everyone, if you would leave your video on, it's nice to have a little sense of community for your speakers to see you, see your reactions, but to leave your microphones off. And just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded, but it will only be the panelists and myself who are showing. So expressing ourselves can be tough, but it's the work we find ourselves in. That is probably where the spiritual work lies, even perhaps the most. We need to find the new words to find our way forward. Life is not static. The world is not static. We are not static human beings. I also like to think this is kind of a time of discovery too, perhaps especially for women, where women would be, figuring out new roles, new ideas of who they are, what their identity is, and I I think that you authors are all uniquely qualified to talk about this. So I have a question for each of you, and I'd like to start with Caroline, if I might, Caroline. And if you could each take a turn answering this, what have you written about that's deeply personal and challenging? This is going to get deep right away, isn't it? What have you written about that's challenging, and what inspired you to write about it?
Hmm. Well, great question. And first off, David, I just have to say, I was sharing earlier before y'all jumped on, I'm having a fan person moment because all of the authors here, and then I see some folks that I'm fans of in the audience, Heather Kopp, hello, and so many other people who've joined tonight. Um, yeah, so I'm having a moment. And this is just, it's so amazing when we can come together like this around topics that we care about. And we all love words, and we all like to dig deep into some hard places through our words and through writing and through connecting with you all and our readers. So, my new book is coming out on the 24th, You Are Not Your Trauma. My mother is also on the line on the call tonight, Diana Dallas, who co-wrote the book with me. And we together are exploring through this book kind of our own experiences of trauma, how that connects, and then how we can heal so that my kids, the next generation don't have to repeat some of those patterns. And so, writing about trauma with your mom is like not an easy thing. Write about trauma in general. So the process of that was so deep and so, um, yeah, just so intimate and hard, but so freeing. And we've both come out of the other side of that process, I think, connecting in a new way. And also we're hoping that readers can connect in a new way, with their story. And as a woman in addiction recovery, a lot of what I write about is addiction recovery, mental health topics, trauma. It's all hard, so starting off the conversation, like getting deep, getting real in recovery spaces, that's just what we do. We lead with it. This is like my dirt. This is what's going on. This is what's hard. And oh, when we do that, it's so freeing. So I'm so grateful to be here and hear from you all, about kind of your thoughts as well. And you're on mute, David.
Thank you. Yes, wonders of Zoom meetings. Shannon, how about we start with you next? You're all primed from having a book that just came out.
I am, and just so happened to have it right here. So if you want to see the cover, this is what it looks like. It came out last Tuesday, so I'm still awfully proud of her. Um, yeah, and this one, I am not in like a mental health field. I'm a writer, I'm an editor, but I do have the same thing that you were talking about, Caroline, of like my comfort zone is just getting vulnerable, like cutting through like the small talk and like let me tell you about what's really going on in my life. So I'm sometimes I wonder if I'm too comfortable with that, like make other people uncomfortable, but it's something that does come naturally for me as a writer, and people have pointed it out and asked about it, and I think it's because I really long so deeply for that human connection, and I know that writing about hard things gets us there really quickly, or if we're in a conversation talking about it. So, um, yeah, in this book particularly, I hit on some things that I haven't written about before. So one that comes to mind is my own history of anxiety and depression, and as a young adult, really struggling with self-harm. So I had never written about that before, and actually, it was really good for me because there was enough space in between. And I think that's one thing that is important to keep in mind when we're writing, that there's a saying that's like you should write from the scar, not from the open wound. And I think that in my life that at least has proven true. Back when I first started publicly writing on a blog, I would sometimes write from the open wound and it was like too much. And then like, later I would realize, oh, that was oversharing. I need to go back and erase that. So I think that's one thing that I've learned along the way. But yeah, I mean, and this book I talk about, several things that are deeply personal and we're not particularly comfortable to write about. So I'm excited to learn from these ladies as well.
Thank you, Shannon. How about Lori?
Hey y'all. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here tonight. Um, I was thinking about this question when you shared it with us earlier today, and I was thinking there's this quote from Andy Crouch where he talks about human flourishing being magnificently oneself. In order for humans to flourish, we have to be fully who we are. And I think of that as sort of living in the truth. And I think for me, writing about it's less about like writing about hard things or writing about easy things. It's just a choice to like live in the truth and whatever the truth is for today. And if that's hard, that's okay. And if that's easy, that's okay. But I think there's such power in saying like life is not the sort of it's not always about sort of, what I used to be or the testimony of what did happen, or what I hope one day will be, but what is. And so much of the message, not to like toot my own horn, but like I came out with a book earlier this year, and so much of the message of that book, the understory, is about just simply being where I am and being who I am. And I think for me, that's just led to writing about whatever, like whatever it is, whether it's hard or not, I'm gonna write about it. I think Flannery O'Connor said something famously like, I don't know what I think until I write. And I think that's true for me. I don't often know how to process difficult things or easy things, joyful things or sad things until I write about them, until I write my way through them. And I think, for example, in this book, in the understory that came out earlier this summer, I write about that alienation and disorientation in the evangelical church over the last 4 to 8 years for me, and what that experience was like, what I lost, and not necessarily what I gained. It's really a book about learning to live in subtraction. So yeah, I think that's probably how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Lori. How about over to you, Dr. Zoe?
Thank you, David. Oh my goodness, listening to you women, I just feel like we're such kindred spirits because for me, writing, I have no interest in writing surface. I like to write deep and I like to read deep. And I just 3 days ago submitted my second book, my draft to my editor. So it feels like, such a burden being lifted off. But this particular book, it's called Stronger in the Difficult Places, Unraveling Complex Shame to Heal Your Relationship with Yourself. It's a much deeper book than my first book, which was about self-care. And in this book, this is a narrative nonfiction book, and it's been a number of years in the making because I both share my personal story, my journey of complex shame, and also as a psychologist, help women, really anyone in particular, anyone, work through their own complex shame, which is a term that I've coined in my work. It's something that I've kind of discovered, which is different than simple and toxic shame. Help people identify it and go on their own healing journey. And the hard story that I share, it's memoir-like in that it's narrative nonfiction, and I really share a story of my experience of coerced adoption. So when I was 16, I placed my child for adoption and developed a shame story as a result of that. And I really also developed a very dysfunctional view and relationship with God. And I later had a daughter. My first child was a girl as well, who was born with severe genetic disorder, and I believed that I was being punished as a result of placing my first daughter for adoption. And I take a reader through my own shame journey and more specifically through my healing. And I'm excited to really just help other people let go of their false stories and understand how shame is sabotaging their life and how to overcome it. So that's my hard story that I'm very excited to get out into the world.
Thank you. It's always inspiring, especially when a clinical psychologist will tell their own story as well,
Mm-hmm.
instead of being behind the professional stance, which is also there. Um, Kristen, thank you for being patient. How would
Of
you answer the
course.
question, what you've written about that's challenging and what inspired
Whew.
you to write about it?
Well, I feel like the only thing I've ever written are things that are challenging. I don't know how to write anything else. And there are so many therapists on the call. You could probably unpack that for me. Email me later and tell me why I did. Just kidding. Don't do that. I'll cry. I need to read Caroline's book before I'm ready to unpack that. But I really connected with what Shannon was saying about just that human connection and wanting to say things that are true because of the way it just kind of like cuts past everything else. And now we're just talking about the real stuff. And I grew up in an environment where negative feelings were to be spiritually bypassed. And I was never able to quite figure out how to do that. And so I was a very uncomfortable child to be around and an uncomfortable adult. The book that I just wrote is called Even If He Doesn't. And also, I have Lori's book right here, and I also have Kurt Thompson's book on shame, which shows you what I'm going through at the moment. But the hardest thing I think about writing this book was writing about my shifts in faith because I come from a very conservative environment where any kind of like diversion from that kind of faith is seen as really dangerous and really scary. And I didn't even put half of it in the book, but writing what suffering kind of did to my faith was a really scary thing to do because then I had to go and talk about it. And then I had to face people in my life reading my book and having questions. And I'm sure they already all had opinions and thoughts about the things that I was sharing online, but I just don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to write any other way. Maybe one day I will have happy things to say, but right now it's just been hard things, and the connections that have come from that have been so good and so good for me as a human to move past the hard things by talking through them and writing about them and connecting with other people like we're doing tonight.
Kristen, could we stay with you for a minute? You mentioned how you were brought up in a world that doesn't necessarily talk about or allow feelings to be discussed. Why do you think that is, or just talk about that experience more? And you're not unique, obviously, but you have your unique
No.
experience with it. Mhm.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a charismatic environment, so it was very much like word of faith. If you speak it into existence, it's going to happen. So if you speak good things and true things, then those good and true things are going to happen. So if you said, I'm not feeling well today, don't claim that. Don't claim that. You got to claim health and wholeness. And I was never I now I know as an adult that I'm neurodivergent. So I always saw that as lying and I didn't want to lie. But I'm not good. I could never quite get that abstract concept of speaking things in faith, but I think sometimes our faith frameworks are so rigid that when somebody says something or experiences something that's outside of that framework, instead of engaging with that uncomfortable thing or that thing that might be true or that thing that kind of pushes against our beliefs, it's easier to just push it out and blame the person and tell them not to say those things than it is to engage with it and come to an answer that's not
Mm.
comfortable or not clear.
So could someone talk about what are the feelings? What are the feelings when you feel like you cannot talk about yourself? Can you put some words to those feelings? Does that strike a chord with anyone? I mean, it takes work to do that, I think. But what are some of those feelings when you think about not being able to express yourself? What are the feelings that come to mind?
Well, for me, it sounds like that's on some level the definition of shame is this belief that what you are feeling is somehow wrong or you inherently are wrong. And so you feel a sense of shame, and the result is usually hiding. And one of the reasons why I write is because as a reader, I know that feeling of freedom and that sense of being seen when I read something that someone else wrote that I might not have necessarily recognized in myself fully, or maybe I did, but I would have never spoken it. And I want to provide that for other readers to give them a voice that maybe they didn't have or couldn't find.
I wonder how we then take those next steps indeed on getting past those feelings. One of the questions that we talked about or we shared earlier was what role does storytelling play in the healing process for both the writer and the reader, perhaps? Um, Lori, Shannon? Carol?
It's funny that Kristen held up Kurt Thompson's book, The Soul of Shame, because I think it's the opening words in that book says, so I think it's in that one where he says we come into the room looking for someone who's looking for us. And I think that's such a powerful, powerful line. And I think that is, that is what we are all doing. We all want to be seen, and we all want someone, a specific person and also a general person, to see us for who we truly are. And that when we can share a story, I think that's, it goes back to C.S. Lewis's ideas about friendship, like you too, me too. I experienced that too. And when we do that, there's like beautiful, beautiful like healing that can happen there, wholeness that can happen there, synergy that happens there. Just like beautiful things happen when two people can face one another as they truly are themselves, and to allow themselves to be themselves, and to, Norman Wiersbe says, be liberated into wholeness. And I think we do that when we walk into the room and we see someone who needs to be seen. We liberate them into wholeness with that.
Thank you. The role of story in expressing ourselves. Shannon? Caroline? Feel like a teacher.
It made me think of the research for this latest book that I did on the mystics, because being Catholic, I was familiar with all of them, by name and sort of general idea of, what they did in their lives that made them noteworthy. But once I started reading their words for themselves and really kind of got caught up in the narrative of their lives, the storytelling was what changed me. And it really just struck me as, wow, not much has changed in hundreds of years. Of like people, I mean, this is like this is human nature, but we are so moved by story. And, it can be, fiction or nonfiction, but for me, when I was really, I think part of the reason that I researched and wrote this book was because I felt really alone in Christianity. And so I was looking for something that was not the most popular podcast or the best-selling book, because all of those I felt really isolated from the language, the vocabulary, the kind of culture around those things. And so I was like, I need something old that nobody else is talking about, So kind of going back to these women and reading about their lives, and they come alive and they become personal. And I feel like I chose to weave a lot of my own stories and my own experience into this book, which I know from reading Goodreads reviews, which yes, authors read the Goodreads reviews, at least this one does. Like I realized that's that's for some people and it's not. Some people were disappointed that I talked about my own life so much and that wasn't straight biography of these women. But for me, I felt like the gift of these women was setting this precedent of speaking for yourself, telling your own story, talking about things that might be uncomfortable, because in doing so, you're inviting other people to do the same thing for themselves. And like Lori said, it's that aha moment of like, you too, I'm not alone anymore. And so I felt like I wanted to take what was extended to me from these women and extend it to the reader from myself as well.
And I'd like to just kind of go off that, Shannon. I love that word invitation. And I feel like, all of you in the room, authors, the books that I have read that you've written, and Zoe, I can't wait to read. When is yours coming out?
August 2025.
Nice.
Yeah.
But reading each of your books, and Shannon, I'm reading your new one right now. It feels like this invitation to get to know obviously you all and your stories, but your stories help me get to know myself in a new way too. And I'm finding that the more that I'm connecting with other authors and stories, I don't know, I'm just in this place of really wanting to continue to discover and learn more about not only, myself and my recovery, but how I can show up, authentically, how I can write with integrity today. So I don't know, your stories just it unlocks something for me. And I've been really in that place of wanting to read and wanting to just saturate myself with this deep thinking. And Shannon, I love that you're bringing back things from the past because that's what I find myself drawn to is like the old stuff, and Lori, like the way that you can just like pull from these authors I'm just like, oh, I love that, and I love you doing that in your writing too. So anyways, just the storytelling and it unlocks something for me inside me and it's just this invitation. And I know, in rooms of recovery, when we do that, when we share our stories with integrity and honesty and openness, you can see in the eyes of the other person, maybe sitting across from you or in the room, like it unlocks something for them too, and sometimes that light it comes back on and it's just a beautiful thing. It's a mysterious thing. I wish I had more words to describe it sometimes, what's happening, because there is this beautiful mystery, I think, too, involved in that honesty and connection and storytelling.
Caroline, I'm going to ask you to focus on your book a little bit. You do something very unique in your book where you have more than one person's story. And can you explain what that is? Because that is something unique.
Yeah, so I really wanted, I think there's a lot of books out there right now, which, I love books, I love it all, but, I want this to be an experience and a movement reading. I don't want it to just be like, here's the 5 things, go do them. Like, here's another self-help, faith-based book. I want it to be an experience and a movement. And I feel like we can get there through stories. And so in my books, I've had the feedback, and Shannon, I love that I'm not the only one who like looks at reviews, but like it's a little all over, it's here, it's there, but I want you to go on this journey with me, like the understory. I want you to go on a walk with me through the woods and see what's happening at the florist floor. And so through the story, I share, as narrative nonfiction, pieces of my own story, weaving in research, definitely some practical application, some questions, some journal prompts, but also my mother, Diana Dallas, included throughout are these excerpts from her journal and from her own experience, where it just brings this. I think, it's her unique voice. It's just a different story woven throughout, and I think it just provides this depth that is so I don't know, for the reader, my hope is that it's an experience, that it moves them. So anyways, we've gotten some really great feedback that once you pick up the book, it's hard to put it down, and I love that. So I'm hoping that if people read and feeling like, that they can stay on the path and continue the journey through the end. But yeah, I love not just like giving, do y'all know what I mean? Like, I just don't want it to be like a map laid out. I want it to be an experience.
It's wonderful that there's two voices in your book like that. I do want to get to one of the questions here. It's a good one for all of you. As a publisher, something that I run into every so often is a family member sees a manuscript before it's been published, and there's a conversation that has to happen first. And this Lindsay writes a comment more specifically as being a therapist who got into this work because of mental health history in her family and her own mental health. And she worries about writing about personal things and how that might impact clients of hers who read it. I'd like to hear how you all navigate this issue. Brianna says the same thing. How do we write our stories of pain when they're so interwoven with others who may not want us, may not appreciate us telling it? Dr. Zoe, would you like to field that one for starters, just in terms of telling your own story, what you're doing now, and how might that impact your clients? Have you given that much thought? I'm sure you have.
Oh, hours and hours of thought to it. And it is difficult and it is emotionally it's work. to be a writer and to put your personal story out there. I do it as well on my podcast. And so I regularly have to ask myself these questions because I have a caseload of clients that I work with. And yet on my podcast, I share some very personal things. And so there's two things. Um, Number one is I've decided that I choose to model myself as a human, not as this authority who has it all together. And I'm okay. I've become okay, I should say, because I've definitely struggled with it as I struggled with my own shame. But I'm okay if I lose some people who want me to be something that I'm not, if that makes sense. I am on a healing journey. And what I do know is that I have garnered a lot of wisdom along the way and I have a lot to offer. And those are the things that I have to tell myself. And the other really important thing that I got a temporary tattoo on my forearm, which I put on Instagram when I was finishing up the manuscript for this book. And it said, "You own your story." And a lot of people who have been through some very difficult things, especially when family members who are usually involved to some in some way or another, get this message that we don't own our stories because other people are involved in them and we are taught to hold them in. We are taught to keep the secret, right? And so my job for me and for other people who I'm really working to help release shame is understanding that you own your story and so you can tell it. Now, what you can't tell is other people's stories. Right. And in my writing, I acknowledge that I am writing from my point of view, from my experience. And I try to be as respectful as I can to the people involved so that I'm not imposing any of their story onto mine, if that makes sense. And I'm recognizing that their story looks different than mine, even though we had this experience together. And I think that if you come from this place, which is hard to get sometimes, of I own my story and I can tell it in a respectful way, even though other people may be offended by it, I think you're on the right road.
Marion Roach Smith has this beautiful little book called The Art of Memoir, I think it's called. And she has a chapter in there about writing about other people's stories. And I have a little printout that sits literally right in front of me on my desk. It's a quote from her. She says, "I have told the truth, but not the whole truth.
Mm.
To tell the whole truth is a fool's errand. I I have told the truth, but not the whole truth. To tell the whole truth is a fool's errand because we can't tell the whole truth. We
Right.
can only tell the truth from our perspective." And that's like such a freeing thing to know, like, I'm not telling the whole story. I can't tell the whole story. Even if I were to try to tell the whole story, I couldn't do it. It's a fool's errand. So it frees me up to just tell the truth as I see it from my point of view and to be clear about that to people. Like, hopefully they can understand that and appreciate that and see themselves in that. Like, oh, I have a truth too, but it's not the whole truth. And I think that's incredibly freeing.
That's beautiful. And I just wanted to add the thing, David, about clients, because I also write about people. I write about my clients and I do it as an anonymously, meaning that what I do is I take the essence of the story, especially when it's not specific to my personal story, right? So that I have my own personal narrative, but when I'm talking about other people, I take the essence of the story. And often, because there's nothing new under the sun, I have at least a couple of clients who have similar issues. And so I blend their stories together such that I am hiding any of, their own personal information and I am obviously respecting their confidentiality. And yet I can still tell a really great story that gets across the point that I'm trying to get across.
Kristen, your head's nodding a lot over there.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this because I have um a lot of stories that I want to tell and I don't tell. I have anger issues that I have to work through. But the only thing I would really add to that is when you're working on the craft of writing, and you're also wanting to write these things that have happened to you and you want to tell your story, a really good practice for me has been to write once for catharsis and then once for craft. Get it out of your system. Say all the things that you want to say. Don't publish that. Go back and like what she was just saying, take out the essence of it, change the details. What's necessary to make the point that I'm trying to make, and what am I just trying to harm people with? The book that I just wrote, I have stories about a really painful church thing that happened to us, things that happened with my kids, things that happened to us that were like crime related, and I had to be really careful what elements of the story I shared. One, for my kids' safety, what happened at our church involved one of our kids, and they don't know that, and hopefully they will never know that until they're old enough to be mature enough to know that it wasn't actually about them. I didn't share even a quarter of what actually happened there because I don't want to invite that into my life. I don't want that negative energy in my life. I don't want that negative attention on myself or my kids. I've had people show up at my house before and demand that I take things off the internet, and that will rattle you. So I try to just what am I willing to stand on if somebody has an issue with what I've said? Am I willing to talk about this with them? Am I willing to argue with them? If I'm not, I leave it out. But essentially, write once for catharsis, once for craft, and you'll get a lot of the stuff that you might regret publishing out after you edit it the second time.
Kristen, that's
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's amazing advice. And I think I'm learning that. I'm learning some of those things with this book, and it's been painful. But it's been an opportunity, I think, too. But one of the things that has been so helpful for me, and how Dr. Zoe and I met, was through the Grit and Grace Project. And so having like a community of writers, for us, like a smaller group of women in particular who are like doing the thing, that I can reach out to and say, hey, this situation is going on, or just feeling like I have a group of like-minded people that I'm connected to, that if I have questions or I'm not sure, and always making sure that there are multiple sets of eyes on things, because, I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to miss something. I missed something in the book that was like a detail that was really disturbing to someone. And, I didn't see it. And also having like the humility to recognize, I made a mistake. Here's what I can do. Here's what I'm willing to do. And recognizing, when there's pieces that are stories that are not mine to tell, but how can I also have integrity by sharing, the truth of, my experience in that storytelling. Yeah, it's really an interesting learning opportunity, but I think having that community, that accountability, and those, resources to be able to not do all of this in isolation, for me has been, key for this.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do an audible, and I'm gonna ask you, like, how does this how does this become relevant specifically for women? When you think of what you're trying to offer in your latest book, I'm not gonna remember and say it correctly, but you talk about and embracing the entire reality of womanhood, and there's a lot there, but how does being able to tell your own story, what's truth, what's factual, what's yours to tell, relate to the experience of women?
It's a loaded question.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean it's good and it's really important. I think we're seeing a shift right now going on in our generation of women starting to tell our own stories and starting to tell the truth when it makes people uncomfortable. And for so long, women were really discouraged, and there were social consequences that were much worse than they are today for women who stuck their neck out that way. So it's really inspiring I mean, the ladies on this call, but just, I mean, even people who are not in the public eye in any way, shape, or form have inspired me so much with the way that they are demanding to give voice to their own experience. And I think I think it's a really exciting time to be a woman, and that makes me really happy. Um, I was thinking about kind of that tension of sometimes deciding not to write about someone is actually the right thing. And so kind of there's this absolutely a time to tell the story as you know it, tell the truth as you know it, and like let the chips fall where they may. And then I think of so for instance, in this book, I wrote one chapter on mother wounds, and I have a great mother, but she's a human, and she's not perfect. And so, but I wrote about a little bit about her and about my grandmother and about how their experience as women um carried over into my life. And but I chose to do it in a way that was mostly the circumstances that my grandmother found herself in, and the time that she lived in, and the things that happened with the death of her own mother, and kind of how those things carry over. But that was a choice to not address it as much from necessarily drawing attention to their shortcomings, or tension that my mother and I have had over a lot of this, over like what we said at the beginning of being free to express difficult emotions as a child. That was not really encouraged in my family, not so much because of religion, but just because of propriety, and like you just keep it easy. You just keep it nice. But so there was definitely like a tension in me as I wrote that chapter. But my mom is really important to me. We have a really healthy relationship. And so it felt like not worth it in that instance to like say anything that would be hurtful for her, that would make her look bad in front of her friends who are reading it or whatnot. So I tried to address it in a way that was kind of more the social constrictions on my mother and grandmother rather than their personal failings. So I think sometimes you have to navigate that too. And I haven't even touched my dad with a 10-foot pole. It's like that's too complicated. So, it's kind of, you have to weigh like whether it's worth it, whether the point can be made another way or with another story, or kind of working outside the box a little bit.
I think one of the things about the time that we're in right now, and I see this in some of the authors that I work with, is uh, wanting to walk people through things slowly and sensitively as it gets to a hard story. Kristen writes in the chat, and please, we have just about 14 minutes here, everyone. So if there's other questions you might have, please, now's the time. But Kristen writes, advice for aspiring authors on how to gently but truthfully lead your readers through your hard story in a way that builds their trust and doesn't traumatize your reader. Any craft tips there?
Well, one of the things that I did, and David, was just incredible in kind of supporting that through the editing process, but periodically throughout, because I recognize that there is some content that really requires kind of like a trigger warning type of approach where it's checking in with the reader, asking reflective questions, reminding the reader like this is and could be potentially challenging content. In the back of the book, we include resilience practices. So 5 different exercises, including some type of, grounding and different types of exercises, breathing exercise that can really help if people are finding themselves triggered by certain content. I also, really recommend with certain books and this one as well, reading in community, so even if you're reading independently, having a person that you're checking in with as things are coming up, reminders throughout, like it's okay and even like really good. I even call out my therapist, Lindsay, which I don't know if she's on, but hey, Lindsay, like if we need to check in or if we need to take this to the next level in terms of seeking some outside support or mental health support, like let's do that, like let's do that together. And so kind of having this conversation throughout and checking in, but that was very intentional as I went through and writing the book. And, David, as I said, working with you to make sure that checking in with the reader and, wanting to be a safe, I talked about earlier, moving through and having it be an experience, but a safe one. And one that, hey, if it becomes like triggering for you, there are ways that you can take care of yourself through that, and encouraging the reader to do so.
I'll add that I think there are ways to do that stylistically. I think one of the best things that writers can do as you're building your craft is to get really familiar with poetry, reading poetry and writing poetry, even if you hate it. I know poetry is like a controversial thing sometimes with writers, but I think when you are familiar with poetry, it teaches you pacing and rhythm. And when you're writing about hard things, depending on how you're writing a book, if you're writing it in the memoir style, I think it's good to bring readers into it, but know when to take them out of it and when to bring them back into it. So you're not just overloading with a really heavy story in one go. You can bring them into the heavy story, take them out for a second, talk about something else, give them a chance to breathe through your words, and then bring them back in. And then they won't feel so exhausted by the end of the chapter or the end of the book, because they'll feel like it's conversational and you're going through the motions of a conversation through the style of your writing, if that makes sense.
I'm so glad you said that, Kristen, because one of the things I did in the understory was I tried to tell a little bit of the story, and then I pulled people out of the story and put them into sort of this like left brain interaction. I'm teaching them some science and things like that. And I don't know if anyone's had EMDR, but basically, and Dr. Zoe, you can talk probably much more extensively about this, but we need our left brains and our right brain to talk to each other. And something like EMDR can help do that, but we can help do that as writers by engaging both the right side of our brain and the left side of our brain, and helping our readers to engage both sides of their brain, so that they're not just stuck in this sort of like emotional traumatic story forever and ever and ever, like Kristen said, but that we can bring them back out, help them to engage in a related way. We can help them to engage that left side of their brain, teach them something, help them to apply something or whatever, just like externalize it. So it's not just, you're not just holding it in your body. And so it does. And I think, Kristen, your advice about poetry is so helpful, because when we learn how to work with cadence, and again, this goes back to what you were saying about writing once for catharsis. I think when we're writing for catharsis, maybe we don't need to pull ourselves out and engage that left part of our brain. But when we're writing for the reader, it is so helpful to be able to sort of rock back and forth with those things and help them to make those connections. It's good for their brains, and it's good for our brains too.
Lori, I love that. How brilliant that you intentionally took them from, emotional to logic and back and forth. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And we do know that not only is that helpful to bring them out, but it also helps to integrate any trauma experience that they're feeling. So that's wonderful. In my book specifically, because I've read so many good books that talk about trauma, and they talk about all how detrimental trauma is to you and all the negative things. And sometimes I will not finish a book because it just pulls me down too much. And I feel like I just don't want to just continue to read how screwed up I am and how screwed up I will be. And so what I did in my book is at the end of every chapter, I also kind of did what you did, Lori, in terms of kind of having some practicality. But what I did is I had a section at the end of every chapter called Hope for Your Future. And what I do is I take them out of that negative space, whatever place they are in the journey of their shame, and give them specific hope for where they are, so that they're not stuck in this deep place. And although it's not taking them out of an emotional state, it's just lifting them up in an encouraging way and saying, yeah, this might be going on with you, but this is the beauty that can come out of it. And this is the hope for you as you work through that step. And so I consistently kind of do the same thing, take them in and bring them out to help them along the way.
Got some more questions in here. Thank you, everybody. Matthew mentions he's loving write once for catharsis and once for craft. He likes I've been told the truth, but not the whole I've told the truth, but not the whole truth. That's a fool's errand. Do you have any other
Mhm.
quotes or mantras that have been guiding lights in writing your stories? A lot of conversation about poetry. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a quote from Dallas Willard I really love. I think it's from Dallas Willard. He says, what will I think of me if I don't write this? Instead of asking the question, what will they think of me if I write this? What will I think of me if I don't write this? That's been like a really helpful because I think some people can tend toward oversharing and other people can tend toward undersharing. I tend to be an undersharer. And so it just helps me to get a little bit braver and just say, like, what will I think of me if I don't say this? So I've got that written on a little card here. That's been a helpful one for me too.
Ella has a really good question with regard to writing and book writing. Um, and it gets a little bit to the right to once for catharsis and once for your book. But this is a big universal question. How do you discern when to share your writing about hard things for yourself, like journaling, and writing about hard things for others, an audience? So, as publishers, we often say to authors, write for the reader, not just for yourself. But you do want to write what you know, and you do want to write what you want to know too, helping the reader go along with you. But what does it mean to, and how do you tell the difference between writing for yourself and writing for the reader? Any examples?
I think sometimes it's just doing it and making a mistake and saying, "Oh, that was too much," or "I shouldn't have shared that," or "that didn't feel good," or "that made me feel," what do they call it, a vulnerability hangover when you share things that maybe you probably should have just kept in your journal. But I think fear keeps us from sharing at all. And worst case scenario is you just shouldn't have shared it. I mean, nothing bad is going to happen to you. You're just learning how to discern. I don't think any writer is born knowing what to share and what not to share. We just share and we figure it out as we go. And as you mature in your writing journey and your sharing journey, as you build your audience, you'll learn what connects with people and what draws people to you, and you'll learn what turns them off. They will tell you, and other people in your life will tell you too. And sometimes you have to throw that out, and sometimes you have to take note and say, okay, maybe I'll do this a little bit differently the next time. One thing that's been really helpful for me, this probably goes with the mantra as well. Something that I tell myself is that I have to write this to be free. I don't have to share this to be free. And I think sometimes we get that dopamine hit when we post something and we see the comments and we see the likes or we get the feedback or whatever it is, and we can get kind of addicted to getting that feedback, and it feels like sharing it is what's helping us heal, but it's writing it that's helping us heal. And sometimes you just need to know the difference between that and not put all of the stakes of your healing journey or helping somebody else heal with pressing posts. Sometimes it's just for us, and it's just for us to process on our own. But you'll learn that as you go, and it's okay if it's not. It's okay if it's messy, because it will be. All good writers are messy. Write that one down.
I think there's clues in what you all are saying as well for everyday relationships and not just writing. Like how much do you really need to share? Maybe express some things before you come into a conversation where you do need to share, talk about hard things. Yeah. Well, we actually are running down to the end of the hour here. Is there any final comments that anyone wants to offer? It's not required.
I kind of want to piggyback on Kristen again. You're just dropping it like it's hot tonight, Kristen. I mean, you usually are, but I think that it is really, really common in the age of Instagram, TikTok, social media to perform our pain and to exacerbate our healing. Like it just takes so much longer to heal when we're performing our pain for likes and clicks and things like that. And so what I'm not saying is like, don't live in the truth of your pain. Like, absolutely live in the truth of your pain. Don't perform it. That's gonna mess you up. And ask me how I know. That's gonna mess you up for a long time. And so there's something like beautiful and tender about our pain that God wants to draw near to and to heal. and likes and comments and shares don't lead to healing very quickly. It just it makes it worse. So
Well,
I think,
go ahead.
oh, yeah, I think I would just like to encourage writers out there who have a story to not stop. It's hard, and to get your words out to the people that need to hear it, it's a journey. I think I'm maybe 5 or 6 years into writing this story, and it became a memoir first before it got rejected and needed to become a self-help book. And your story will become what it needs to become if you don't stop. And so if you know that you have words, and you probably do if you're here, just keep going.
I will second that, Dr. Zoe, and keep going in community, because it's so healing when we can write together.
Well, I know we all have lives to get back to. Thank you so much. I want to mention I'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone and those also who weren't able to attend with a link to the video. It's just the panelists showing. Um, and please do check out. I mean, I'm in the book publishing business, so I'm going to say it, but it really counts when everybody follows and pays attention. And we live in a world where this is kind of how we're finding community more than ever, and it counts. And you're reading the books, internalizing them. Word of mouth is still the most important way for people to hear about books and get excited about them. Please share them. If you would like to also share this video link when it comes out. I did put the links in for everybody's websites, but I'll also add those as well when we do a follow-up email. And thank you for letting me be the guy here, panelists. I appreciate that. It's a privilege and it's fun to learn. So thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.